Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for this invitation and a chance to speak up here. It seems that lots is happening north of the border at the moment, and I was talking to some folks earlier on about just how much energy there is around these parts at the moment, which perhaps wasn't there a few years ago. And I hope that doing great things with digital technology, and particularly with mobile and wireless, is part of that energy. I was asked to speak particularly about how two particular parts of the technology come together, or their relation to each other, notably cellular and Wi-Fi technologies. So I thought I'd spice it up a little bit with a little bit of cheap science fiction imagery there to talk about how two seemingly distinct worlds are starting to come together, and the extent to which that creates a kind of explosive collision versus creating some level of harmony. And I want to talk a little bit about what's happening that could promote either outcome there. Just a word or two about myself, my company Real Wireless. We act independently of operators, vendors and other stakeholders on things to do with wireless. And I do mean wireless in the broad sense. We work, for example, with some city councils at the moment. And we find that sometimes when people see the word wireless, they think Wi-Fi. And we have to explain that wireless really means a very wide range of options, from broadcast through to those old things that used to listen to radio on, and a wide range of other technologies beyond. And we try and help our customers who are not necessarily in the wireless industry to get their heads around that. So, for example, we run all the wireless in Wembley Stadium, and that was particularly good fun last summer as the biggest stadium venue in the Olympics in 2012. We also do some longer term things. For example, we worked with Ofcom on a number of things related to the 4G spectrum auction, including indeed putting costs to what a 98% obligation across the country might cost somebody bearing that obligation, and what it might look like regionally in Scotland and in other places. So it's been a very interesting experience to actually see that go from the drawing board through to the very real aspects that Sarah's clearly dealing with today. One other thing I should specifically mention is until late last year, I was chairing an organisation that I founded called the Small Cell Forum, or formerly the Femto Forum, and more about that as we go. So a word or two on perceptions, as things have been, something about where we stand today, the reality, and about convergence, which is a much misused and overused word in this business, but which is happening. And it's happening with two evolutionary paths that happen to be coming together, partly by design and partly by luck, you could say. And I want to talk a bit about whether those are actually complementary or whether there's competition in there. And lastly, I can't help but speak about spectrum. So in the old world, remember all those images of cellular operators which always had hexagons in them, and once upon a time cellular operators' real whole world was about designing big base stations and planning radio associated with that. And we had phones and we spoke on those phones. And for some, there was a halcyon day when Nokia 6110s worked really well, and voice coverage seemed, pretty good, and battery life was really quite long. And to some extent, the map on the bottom left, which is actually the same map that Sarah showed, shows the hallmarks of that. We still bear in our mobile networks today some of the signatures of a network designed to deliver voice calls to people in cars speaking on telephones. The cells are broadly in the same places. There's a good few more of them now, and they're starting to share them more intensely, but that heritage is still there at some level. And then there's, dare I say, old world Wi-Fi. It feels a bit odd talking about that as something old, but that was designed as a wireless local area networking technology, a way of connecting computers together that were in the same building. And those computers were not expected to move very much. They weren't intrinsically mobile devices. And it was about data interchange, but typically not in anything like real time, not anything conversational, but grabbing a file from here and putting it over there and then working on it and then putting it back. Those two pictures of the old world really are starting to recede into the background now. Things are changing very substantially. A little bit more of the cheap science fiction here, when worlds collide. Some of that heritage is in people's thinking about these technologies still. Around Wi-Fi, when Wi-Fi started, it wasn't very secure. In fact, it wasn't secure at all. It was extremely hard to make it work well. it's sometimes hard to find. If you were looking for access, you might have to travel a long way. I don't know if you remember, people used to put chalk marks on the street to indicate that there was some free Wi-Fi. It seems a very long time ago. But there's another perception which says that Wi-Fi is free. Whether it's free to use or free to roll out seems to get mixed up in people's minds. That it's fast, certainly can be fast, but it certainly isn't always. Or that it's a self-provided thing, that somehow it's different to cellular, which is a world of something that operators provide. Wi-Fi is something that you do for yourself in your home or your office. Similarly, there are some perceptions around cellular or mobile that it might be expensive, or that the coverage is variable, or that it's entirely operator controlled. Now, clearly, all those things can have a grain of truth in them from time to time and from place to place. But at the same time, the same networks are delivering a level of reliability that you can actually make a call, probably if you get stranded on a road in a remote location, that it's full mobility. You can actually be driving quite fast down the road and still have a call continue. And that it's very convenient to not have to worry about logging onto a network. You just take the phone or other device out of your pocket and get on with using it. So these perceptions are somewhat real, but they also need to evolve to reflect the new world, the new reality. Wi-Fi used to be very much about computers, as I say, but 70% of phones sold today already support Wi-Fi. Computing is no longer about desktop devices only. It has become mobile in a range of form factors. Since about 2007, data on mobile networks has dominated over voice in volume terms, and indeed is now starting to do so in revenue terms. And it is growing. And actually, you mentioned earlier on that to paint a picture of what happens in 2020, you need to understand what people will be doing there. The up and to the right curves there are the results of forecasts of mobile demand that we put together for Ofcom. They're trying to figure out how much spectrum might be needed for the UK in 2030. Now, the main point people usually stress about these sorts of curves is that they go up very steeply. What I'd like to stress is the fact that they vary a lot. All of those forecasts are entirely credible. And I can find you people who believe the lower end and believe the upper end and beyond. In planning for such an uncertain future where, frankly, we do not know what people will be doing in 2020, partly because they haven't invented it yet. They haven't experienced the benefits of those systems and that connectivity such that they can invent new apps and new ways of parking more easily and so on. And what we need is a way of delivering this which is sufficiently flexible to deal with what changes over time. So remaining dynamic and flexible rather than building a monolithic infrastructure that can't change. Clearly, mobiles are computers today. There isn't a difference between them. Our data's in the cloud, which means we need to get to it connected all the time. And increasingly, video as a slice of that total is a very substantial proportion. So somehow all of that needs to be supported. Now, these former worlds were seen as very distinct technology tracks. They were certainly invented in different places, and different people were associated with them. So the cellular track, which now sits under the 3GPP umbrella, particularly from a standards perspective, has moved on from 2G to 3G to, I resisted saying 4G for a long time, because it's a very ill-defined concept, and we'll push that even further later on by talking about 5G. But nevertheless, commonly that's what we're talking about. And an evolution path well beyond that. And Wi-Fi has had an entirely separate evolution path, where some of the flaky old 802.11b items have now given way through several generations to 11AC, or are beginning to appear in the marketplace. And with that technology evolution, yes, it's higher speeds and there's a greater range of spectrum bands, but there are also new architectural possibilities. There are new ways of bringing networks together. The devices really aren't different devices. And then the question arises, well, how do we bring these strands together? And there are two important initiatives or changes which promise to do that. One is HETNets, heterogeneous networks, and the other is carrier Wi-Fi. Now, both of those have happened separately for these two technology tracks, but I hope to illustrate that they actually mean they end up being something of the same thing. Now, the early 90s mobile networks were planned with a lot of big iron and towers in them, and John and his organisation knows a lot about what it takes to site such a tower and to get a community on side in thinking that's actually a good thing. But even going back that far, a lot of the network is actually much more subtle and is sitting closer to people on the streets in microcells, in offices in the form of picocells, and even today in your home in the form of a femtocell. But formerly, those little cells were conceptual or needed in very particular places, but were not really widespread. And the business of rolling out a mobile network was almost entirely about the really big cells and getting the best from those, quite reasonably. Today, however, there's been a huge evolution of that. Because we mostly access our devices indoors, to efficiently deliver that and to do it in a way that works well, an increasing part of the network is closer to the user, either indoors or on the street. And these are real examples of real products that are out there today in mobile networks. And a surprising thing, perhaps, is the United Kingdom as a whole is one of only 2 countries in the world where all of the mobile operators will offer you a femtocell so that you can provide great 3G coverage in your home or your small office if you know how to ask for it and where to find it on the website, but it's there and it's part of the offering. Picocells are allowing the same kind of connectivity in offices, and I hope to see a day when enterprises can provide that for themselves in their own image, in the way that they have with Wi-Fi, that they've been able to create networks that meet their business needs, and that cellular can be a part of that and can be both part of an operator's service offering and part of an enterprise's IT system at the same time. And increasingly there is a lamp grab underway to secure rights to street furniture, street infrastructure, to deliver high capacity, but particularly high performance services, services that are much faster, that realize the potential of 4G. And also to do it in a rural environment. So most of the industry talks about this in the context of busy urban locations, which is very valid, but equally finding villages and small towns, which would formerly have been uneconomical to deliver to, the opportunity to put a very small, low-profile piece of infrastructure in place, right in the heart of the village green or the equivalent, does open up new economic opportunities. This isn't futuristic. It will happen more in the future, but there are already more of these small cells in networks around the world than there are big cells, despite the fact that some operators haven't deployed them at all yet. In fact, at least one mobile network in this country has getting on for 100 times more of the little cells than the big cells in their networks, and many more to come. So mobile networks have turned into things that can be delivered by end users in small boxes in their homes, offices, and communities. Wi-Fi was always like that, but has been through its own and is going through its own evolution from a private network deployed in particular locations. Going back as far as 7 or 8 years, there have been attempts to make Wi-Fi do cellular-like things, like mobility and so on. Those stuttered, perhaps even failed completely. But we're moving forwards to an environment where these really are part of a wider network. And there is a thing called Hotspot 2.0 or carrier Wi-Fi, which promises to really deliver that kind of ease of use. There's a huge support for this now, which wasn't there previously, embodied in some of the major organizations like the Wireless Broadband Alliance and the Wi-Fi Alliance for next generation hotspot, Hotspot 2.0 and other things, which addresses many of the user frustrations with Wi-Fi, of log on, of handover between devices, even of global roaming between operators. It requires a lot to happen on the mobile devices as well as in the access points themselves, but there is an expectation that they will increasingly provide a part of mobility services. Now the balance between these and mobile is up for grabs. There's a different expectation and willingness to pay, but certainly mobile operators are rolling out Wi-Fi networks of their own. Fixed network operators, who often have a piece of spectrum in the cupboard, are starting to roll out and look at how they can offer a part of the small cell picture as well. So actually, when we started Small Cell Forum, I make no bones about it, some of femtocells, some of the evolution of femtocells was mobile operators wanting a competitive response to Wi-Fi. They saw that as a threat. But enlightenment dawned relatively quickly, I'm pleased to say, and we went from an era of Wi-Fi versus femtocells to an era of, well, actually, these are in somewhat different devices and deliver somewhat complementary services. That was the kind of Wi-Fi plus femtocells era. And today I think we're in the Wi-Fi times femtocells era, where the two technologies working together actually deliver a better end result. A brief word in my dying seconds before the moderator cuts me off about spectrum. I can't help myself but speak a little bit about spectrum. That big step in the amount of mobile spectrum available is the 4G auction, which has just happened, and you know, the £1 billion that was lost down the back of the sofa. And I quote Ofcom's chief executive there, by the way. We are clearly into the beginnings of the 4G era, but that's not the end of the story in terms of spectrum. Next year, the MOD plans to auction some more spectrum. The year after that, they plan to do some more again. There's a whole bunch of other bands, and we're currently helping work out how much will be needed in 2030 to support the longer-term evolution of these technologies. Perhaps less well known, Wi-Fi spectrum is changing too, and there are big bands up for grabs that will provide more Wi-Fi capacity. So I happen to think there is no limit to the amount of spectrum, or spectrum will not constrain the opportunity to deliver the rate and the usefulness of services in the future. You have to use it right. So I hope I've illustrated that what were separate worlds really are now part of a rich tapestry of ways of delivering great mobile and wireless services. There are signs that this mixed economy will involve both operators and end users in putting networks together that work for both of them. It allows you to make use of all the spectrum that's out there, and it allows you to deliver services not two-dimensionally on a map, but in the places you care about, predominantly your home, your office, and some places in between. Thank you very much for listening.